We're starting our fall season of the St. Andrew Bay Watch Citizen Science Lecture Series, and we're glad to have you here. I'm Linda Fitzhugh. I teach biology here, but I also am a board member with St. Andrew Bay Watch. And I have some other board members here. First of all, John Ackerman, who will be speaking, is one of our board members. And we'll do more introductions with him later. We have Stephen Thiebert. He's one of our board members. Fisheries biologist. If students, if you're interested in learning more about fisheries and stuff, you can chat with him. Where's Alan Collins? Oh, Alan Collins right here. Another fisheries biologist. Any other board members besides the four of us that I'm missing anyway? But welcome so much for coming to the Citizen Science Lecture Series. This is, we want to highlight things that are going on in our community that people are out involved in doing. And with that, I think, Norm, you have an announcement you'd like to make about another activity if you're interested in doing some volunteer work.
Thank you very much, Linda. The International Coastal Cleanup, Ocean Securities Coastal Cleanup Day is September 17th, and Lake Powell Community Alliance and St. Andrews Bay Watch are co-sponsoring, and Friends of Camp Ellen are co-sponsoring the Lake Powell cleanup, which will include cleaning up Lake Powell and the beach associated with Camp Ellen. We start at 8 o'clock in the morning. Folks who get there early and get registered will be able to get a beautiful free color t-shirt showing that they participated in the event. Have the option either of registering at the Bay County Park boat ramp or at Camp Ellen, and we expect a great turnout. We'll have cleanup walking groups as well as boat groups. If you have a kayak, you can bring kayaks and a friend and do a kind of a hybrid coastal cleanup and have a great time doing it. I think we're going to have pizza this year after the event, sponsored by someone, I forgot. But at any rate, we're going to have pizza.
It's like 8 to 12, isn't it? Yeah, so it's half a day. And,
so it's a half-day event, and we'd love to see some volunteers out there and help clean up.
And it's Saturday, September 17th.
Right.
Yeah. And if you can sign up that morning either at Camp Helen and the Lake Powell boat ramp, right?
Either
Okay.
place.
So if you know where Camp Helen is, some of the students in here may or may not know that it's all the way in the west end of the beach. Keep going like you're going to Seaside, but before you get to 38, you'll see right over the Phillips Inlet Bridge, Camp Helen is the first left.
And if you don't know where the boat ramp is, the Ocean Conservancy site is the cleanup site, and there are GPS coordinates on there for where we'll be located.
Super, thanks. Are there any other announcements of things going on, community events? So St. Andrew Bay Watch is a local environmental group. We do shoreline restoration, and we have people like Johnny Smallman, who's just like, who helps us organize shoreline restoration. We do water quality monitoring, we do seagrass monitoring, scallop restoration, a turtle watch. So we have lots of different programs that we do. If you're interested in finding out more about St. Andrew Bay Watch and all the things we do in the community, then come see any of us board members that I've introduced already. So I'm going to just do a small introduction to John. I'm going to let him talk a little bit more about his background and what he'll be speaking of. But John is a professor of political science at Ashford University, and we are very lucky that he is on our board of directors. So St. Andrew Bay Watch is a local community group, and we have a board of directors that directs. We're all volunteers, like we're not like paid board of directors, but we're all volunteers that help guide the organization, write grants, because most of our projects are done as grant funded, and John is now on our board, and he's been there for about a year and a half, 2 years?
Yep, about a year and a half.
So we're very, very fortunate to have him with us. He is going to talk about climate change and its environmental impacts and national security impacts. And without further ado, John Ackerman.
Thanks. Well, welcome everybody. Just real quick, a little bit about me. I grew up in Fort Walton Beach, and then after I graduated from Florida State University with a degree in biology, the Air Force, in their infinite wisdom, sent me to a base in South Dakota to do intercontinental ballistic missile operations, and which had nothing to do with biology, but that's where the Air Force thought I would do a good job. So I did missile operations for a while with the Air Force for about half my career, and then the second half of my career I did what they call professional military education. I taught at Air Force's schools up in Maxwell Air Force Base at both the Squadron Officer School and the Air Command and Staff School, and during that time period I was lucky enough to get selected to go get a PhD. The only deal was I had to come back and pay them back by teaching at the school, but that was okay with me, so I came back, got my degree in political science and international in the news for a variety of reasons, and sometimes what's lost in the discussion is what does it mean here. So I'm going to discuss a little bit about how it's going to affect the southeast part of the United States and a little bit about Panama City itself. But then I'll go back out to the macro level and I'll talk about what are the national security implications, because that doesn't really get discussed a lot in the news, and how climate change could create some situations where our national security could be threatened. Okay. So this is the basic lineup for tonight. There's been a lot of things said about climate change, and some of the most recent comments lately kind of frame the issue as something that's serious. It's something that we should all be thinking about, and it is something that our president and the leaders of most nations are discussing on a regular basis. It's coming.
Oh, okay.
I hope.
Climate change has been in the news for years, but what is it, and how does it affect us? To understand climate change, you first need to know about the greenhouse effect. The Earth gets heat from the sun. In the atmosphere, greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide trap this heat and keep it from escaping back to outer space. Trapping some heat in the atmosphere is a good thing, because it keeps the planet warm enough for us to live. But there's a problem. People all over the world are adding extra carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. That's because today we burn fossil fuels, like coal, oil, and gas, to do many of our everyday activities, like driving our cars, using our computers, and heating our homes. All of this extra carbon dioxide is trapping more heat in the atmosphere, making the Earth warmer and causing other climate changes too. The signs of climate change are all around us. Temperatures are getting warmer, giant ice sheets are melting, and the oceans are rising. In many places, flowers are blooming earlier, snow is melting sooner, and birds aren't flying as far south for the winter. So why does this matter? Well, if the planet keeps getting warmer, we can expect more powerful storms and more flooding, droughts, and heat waves. And these changes could cause additional problems, like the spread of certain diseases, more wildfires, and food and water shortages. Climate change could put entire ecosystems, like coral reefs, in danger, and many plants and animals could become extinct. The good news is that we can take action. We can put less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere if we generate electricity from clean sources, like solar and wind power, instead of burning coal, oil, or gas. We can also drive less, use public transportation, and choose cars that go further using less gas. And you can do your part. Reduce your energy use by turning off the lights, the computer, and the TV when you're not using them, and walk or ride your bike to work or school. By making smart choices and working together, we can make a difference. Check out the rest of this website to learn more about the causes and effects of climate change, as well as the practical solutions that can help protect our planet's future.
I could probably stop right there, and you would see a pretty good argument as to why climate change is important, but some of the specifics, some of the details are lost in a very general argument. So here you can see some of the more details. The temperature's rising, and there's arguments, okay, well, how do you know the temperature's rising? Well, we got 3 different temperature reconstruction models that they've used, we, the British, and the Japanese, and those models are pretty much matched up. They all show the temperature's been increasing, and it's something to worry about. And along with that increase in temperature, more rainfall, more intense rainfall, and you just saw it recently in Louisiana, how that has a huge effect on populations. And with that, we have sea level rise for a variety of reasons, mostly because with the increased temperature, oceans will expand because of thermal expansion, but also because there's a lot of melting of polar ice caps and things like that, which are we locked? Okay. Which a lot of the heat's being absorbed by the oceans, but not all of that heat's being absorbed by the oceans, and most of that heat is in the upper part of the oceans. So the heat's being captured in some areas, but not in other areas. And along with all of the changes that are happening to our surface areas, the oceans are also increasing in acidity because all of that greenhouse gases and primarily the carbon dioxide is being converted to carbonic acid in the oceans. And as you can see from there, a 30% increase in the acidity of the ocean. How that will play out, what the ecosystems in the oceans will do in response, we're not quite sure. And again, I mentioned the ice sheets and the glaciers melting, and again, the increased temperatures. These are all these fingerprints we're seeing around the world. Okay, this is an interesting little depiction of how the temperature has changed since the 1800s. And how it will change into the future if we don't do anything. So by 2100, if things don't change, we could see up to a 5 to 6 degree change. So what does that mean for us here in the United States? And again, a lot of these results are dependent upon the actions we take or don't take. Under a scenario where we reduce emissions a certain amount, you can see the warming will be substantial in some areas of the United States, particularly out in the west. Here in the southeast, we look pretty good. However, if we don't reduce those emissions, the heartland of the United States will warm significantly, 10, 15 degrees, and you can see it where in Alaska, they're going to have some real high levels of warming there within the next 100 years. And again, as I mentioned before, the intense rainfall, not so much out in the west, and in fact, in some areas, they're still suffering from significant drought. Here in the southeast, a 27% increase. Ma'am, when I stand there? So don't stand there, right? Okay. All right, I'll move out of the way. I'll just keep moving around. Now, these changes in temperature, changes in climate, and things like that have resulted in a lot of different types of disasters. You've watched the TV, you've seen the extent of the rainfall problems, flooding, droughts, storms. Again, here in the southeast, we've been significantly impacted. Florida, 26 to 35 different events between 1980 and 2012 that cost over $1 billion. So these events are costing a lot of money. And now if we take that that continental perspective down a level and we look at what's happening here in the southeast, there's a great report out there by the National Climate Assessment. You can get it online and you can look at it. It has all of the United States covered. If you've got a particular area of the United States you'd like to look at, that's a great report to look at. So in the southeast, we haven't seen as much of the warming as quickly as other parts of the United States. And as you saw from that first map, you could see where they're not predicting as a high rate of warming. And as the graph shows it easily, we're a little below. And they're not quite sure why, but a lot has to do with where we're located, being on kind of surrounded on two sides by oceans and things like that. And this graph, this map shows you that much of the warming will occur in the south, particularly in Florida. And so what does that mean? We're going to have more days where it's over 95 degrees during the summertime. A significant increase of 95 or more during the summertime. On the other side of the coin, we're going to see less freezing. Now here in Florida, southeast, we don't worry about that too much, and again, we're not going to see as many days where it freezes, but look what happens up in the upper part of the southeast, up in Tennessee and Kentucky. They're going to see less and less days where it drops below 32, and you can imagine how that will change some of the ecosystems up there that are dependent upon that freezing type of ecosystem and the plant structures and animal structures there. So it's going to change them significantly. As the sea level rises, the southeast has got some pretty vulnerable areas. As you can see, New Orleans in particular, the Delta region is going to be significantly impacted and is being significantly impacted by sea level rise. If you go around the coast, you can see up in Virginia, North Carolina, they've got a lot of barrier islands that are going to potentially disappear if sea level rise continues to increase. Notice right here in Florida, right where we live, Apalachicola. Apalachicola is a delta region. It is very low, and it has the potential in the future to flood and basically disappear underwater if sea level rises increases. We've got some issues here in our Bay Area. If you want to go see what a rise of 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters in sea level, go to climatecentral.org, and they have some depictions of what those rises in sea levels look like, right down to what's going to happen here in Bay County. So very interesting maps of how sea level rise can change what your neighborhood looks like. Louisiana, again, I bring them up because the Delta region has and is being impacted by climate change. In 1963, you can see this area of the marshlands down there. No significant areas of large water space. By 2008, you have the large areas of open water. Part of that is because of climate change. Part of that is because of the canals that the oil and gas industry created through that area, which increased the erosion. And so you mix up sea level rise plus the increased erosions, and all of a sudden a lot of these marshy areas are disappearing at a high rate. And Louisiana is losing a significant portion of their delta region, which is very important for their economy and also very important as a nursery for a lot of different fisheries. Here in Florida, if you've been watching the TV, every time there is a high tide down in Miami, in comes seawater, and it comes up through their sewer pipes. It floods into the city, up through the sewer pipes. How do you stop that in a city that's not very high above sea level to start with? Do you build walls? Do you build dikes? What do you do? But it's a recurring adventure down in Miami every time there's a high tide, Lauderdale and that whole area. Now, as the temperature increases, we're going to have a lot of those inversions where hot air gets trapped, and that's going to trap ozone as well. And if you look to the west, the area around Texas and Louisiana, because of the oil and gas industries, both onshore and offshore, they have a lot of hydrocarbons being put in the air that contribute to that ozone problem, and so their smog issues are going to be very significant. Fortunately, we don't have those industries at such a high level here in Florida, so it's not such a problem yet. Again, temperature will increase evaporation, it'll increase drought potential, it'll increase potential for flooding. We are going to have some changes in how much water is available. Part of that will be controlled by how much population growth and also how well we do managing our resources, whether or not we encourage more conservation and things like that. But you can see in the Panhandle in particular, we could have 5 to 2.5% decrease in the water availability within the next 100 years. So we'll have to plan ahead for that if we want to be able to deal with it effectively. And this has been in the news for a long time, and if you've been down to Apalachicola and you used to love to get oysters from there, you probably know already about the problem of a lack of freshwater input to that particular ecosystem, causing that to collapse. And so the battle over water from the Flint, Chattahoochee, and what's the other river? There's the Flint, the Chattahoochee, and the Apalachicola River. Yeah. Those three rivers come together in Apalachicola, and the battle hasn't been settled. It's still in the courts. It's still being decided, and we're going to be impacted by that change, whether or not that influx of fresh water continues to arrive in a substantial amount that will benefit the ecosystem. So again, if you're interested in this information, great website to go to. It's available, graphs, they've got downloads and things like that, and data if you're interested in doing research on these topics. There's a lot of available data that you can use on different topics. Now, going out to the macro level, the national security implications of climate change, our government publishes several important documents that tell our friends and allies and also our adversaries what our positions are on key national security issues. We let our friends and enemies and allies know what our stance is because we don't want misunderstandings. And we publish these very important issues and answers in key documents. One is the National Security Strategy, the primary document that the president publishes that says this is what's important to us. And then the military takes that document and says, okay, based on these important things, we're going to publish what we do to accomplish those interests and objectives and to protect them. And the process that the military goes through, the Department of Defense, to create those changes and things like that necessary to support the national security strategy are documented in what they call the Quadrennial Defense Review. And these are documents that are produced on a recurring basis. So most of this information comes from the National Security Strategy or the Quadrennial Defense Review. The National Security Strategy comes from the President. The Quadrennial Defense Review comes from the Department of Defense. So before we go, a lot of different agencies, groups have been studying this. This first quote comes from the Central Naval Analysis Organization. They're a group of retired military generals, admirals, and they have been looking at this issue for a while, and they have found there are significant challenges to our national security created by it. And in the National Security Strategy, it's a clear issue that we must address, and I'll get into more details of why. And then on a more philosophical standpoint, Voltaire kind of says, well, we argue about these issues, but while we're arguing, nature is also doing a lot of different things. So in the National Security Strategy, these are the identified national interests. And they probably shouldn't surprise you. Security is always at the top. We want an economy that gives everybody an opportunity to prosper. And we also have some universal values that we believe that everybody should share. And also a rule-based international system should be something that we should lead and also protect in order for there to be opportunities for economic growth and also security. So these are probably something you should be familiar with. And then when these interests have been identified, what is it that puts them at risk? And in the National Security Strategy, these are the things that threaten our interests. And right in the middle, you see climate change. Many of these others you're probably familiar with too. There are some serious things out there that could threaten our national interests. And now climate change is considered one of those major topics. 10 years ago, it wasn't in the National Security Strategy. So in order for us to protect them, the Department of Defense, their job is to provide us with security, and their job is to protect the homeland and also protect our interests overseas. They have developed what they call their pillars, and again, they're based on that national security strategy, so they should be very similar. Homeland, build security globally, and also whenever we have to get into a fight, we protect power decisively and we win. Okay? And in order to kind of better understand these different threats, in the past, the Quadrennial Defense Review developed a framework of analysis in order to understand what are these threats, what are the characteristics of them, how are they different, how are they similar, and therefore how do I respond to them. So in the past, they identified what they call a traditional threat. That's what we're very well prepared for, force on force, army against army, and we really haven't had anything significant like that since the Iraq War and a little bit in Afghanistan. But that's what we're really good at and have succeeded in those in the most recent future. Irregular threats a little bit different, and that's what we're fighting a lot now, the terrorist threats, the guerrilla warfare, insurgencies, very difficult for our forces, but we've evolved new types of forces to deal with them, and the counterinsurgency forces, you probably have seen a lot on TVs, the special forces, Green Berets, SEALs, things like that. Those are the forces that are tasked with dealing with those type of threats. But there are other things out there that the military has a difficult time dealing with, a disruptive threat, things that negate our traditional advantages, cyber warfare. You know, we use our computer systems, our networks and things like that to do a multitude of things. But if they're attacked, destroyed, or disrupted, our ability to command, control, and use our forces is severely impaired. You imagine if the GPS system went down. How do our planes fly from point A to point B? How do you put those smart weapons on top of a target? So a lot of things can be disrupted really quickly by messing with our computer system. And that's just part of what the disruptive threats would be. And it could even be something as simple as a new virus that we're not familiar with that causes a pandemic in a country, and all of a sudden it spreads rapidly. Last are catastrophic threats, and you've probably heard of the nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, but they also are very worried about other chemical weapons and biological weapons. And we plan for those type of events where a bad guy gets hold of smallpox, for instance, and uses that against a U.S. city. And in the past, smallpox was eradicated. However, we haven't been vaccinating people for smallpox in a while. Us old folks were vaccinated when we were kids, but many have not. Many of young people have not been vaccinated against smallpox. So if it was to get into the hands of someone unhappy with the United States, catastrophic events could occur. So this planning framework works good for discussing those type of threats to national security. So what would happen if you applied this type of structure to a different type of threat? So again, you see how we're pretty strong in the traditional area. The quadrennial defense review said, well, we got to shift some of our focus toward the regular, catastrophic, and disruptive. Okay, that makes sense. That's how we'll do it. But what about a threat that they hadn't considered in the past? What about climate change as a threat? Could you apply that framework against all of the different potential repercussions of climate change? So what I did, I said, okay, well, what's a kind of a traditional threat that we can deal with, have dealt with, and understand? Droughts, floods, and heat waves. We can deal with those. The military can help with those. The military can provide security, they can provide water, they can help reconstruct. So a military can help us with the traditional threat created by climate change. The irregular ones, ocean acidification, environmental refugees, geoengineering. Anybody familiar with that concept when it comes to climate change? Yes, sir. What's geoengineering? The idea is to put sulfate particles up in there, shoot them up with cannons, and the sulfate particles would reflect the heat coming in, and it would cool the atmosphere. Why do we know how this works? Because volcanoes do it all the time. When a volcano erupts, a lot of times there'll be a lot of atmospheric dust, and then there'll be cool periods. And in fact, after enormous eruptions like Krakatoa, we had what they called a winter without, a year without winter. And it remained cool for a whole year and even longer after the eruption of Krakatoa. And back in the past, there have been other times in geologic times where they've tracked eruptions that have had global impacts. So geoengineering, there are other things that they're thinking about in order to address climate change. What other kind of threats would that create? Would it create more environmental refugees? And they've already identified some of the people who live on some of these small Pacific islands who are having to leave as an environmental refugee because their islands the sea level rises increased so much that they're having to leave their islands. So the term now has impact because we can identify people who could be described as environmental refugees. How the military can help with that because we can help them go to a secure area, but they're not entirely prepared for it. Famine, freshwater scarcity, pandemics. Again, very disruptive threats. Military probably has some expertise in helping with those. Isolation, security, providing water, bringing in food and things like that. So those areas the military probably could help reduce the impacts, but catastrophic threats. If the ice caps melt, if an entire state fails or a sequence of state failures, and mass extinctions. And again, these are all predictions. They are all areas where scientists have been studying these and have come to conclusions that there is potential for those because of climate change. So how does our military deal with sudden rise in sea level or a state failure, especially a state failure of a modern state that is an ally or something like that, or state failure of somebody we don't particularly like? And a perfect example is Syria. And we got all these refugees wanting to go different places besides Syria. We don't know what to do with them. We don't know how to deal with them. We can't get international aid in. We got security problems all over the place. And there are some studies that indicate part of the problem that happened in Syria and that area is because of crop failures that were a direct result of climate change. So part of the revolutions that occurred there, part of the reason that Syria collapsed may be attributable to climate change. So now we're encountering these problems. So work all these together. A state fails someplace, we got a famine in another place, we've got a geoengineering problem that's backfiring in another place. All of a sudden you see a military that is stretched to its limits and lacking capabilities to deal with a lot of these problems. So what it could create is that perfect storm where we're unable to react, or we react piecemeal and we're not able to provide the security, protect the homeland, bolster our economy, and protect those values and rule-based society that we consider very important. We're pretty well in good shape. We can deal with a lot of these problems, but the problem is what happens with the left-hand side, who helps them? And especially when you think about where the population masses are. The population masses are in those developing states. They're in India, they're in China, they're in Brazil. All of these states have certain vulnerabilities to climate change that we have to be aware of. If you talk about floods, look at the Delta region in China where billions of people live. Bangladesh is all in a Delta region. The entire country is built upon a Delta region. So if that floods, where do those people go? Irregular threats, again, if you got people moving from place to place, or if you have, for example, ocean, the acidification causes a collapse in a fishery that states are dependent upon, where do those people go for food? Where do they go for new employment or anything? Something we'd have to deal with. Disruptive threats, the changes in climate have huge impacts on our agricultural capabilities. So if you melt the ice caps in the Andes and the regular amount of water that they normally get for their crops suddenly decreases, what do? How do they change? How do they adapt? Very difficult. And catastrophically, those delta regions are a huge concern because there are massive populations of people on them. And in many countries, it's a developing country, and they don't have the infrastructure or the capabilities to deal with these changes, especially if they occur rapidly. And that's one of the things that we're worried about is a rapid change in climate, which causes perhaps the Gulf Stream to stop moving and carrying heat up toward the poles. Huge impact on both the east coast of the United States and on Western Europe. But there are lots of solutions. Just Google up climate change solutions. If I made you pessimistic about the possibilities of fixing this, don't be, because there are so many things we can do to change it now, and there are things that are happening now and have been going on for a while. So pessimism won't help because there are so many opportunities for us just as individuals to help out. And if any of these aren't things that you're familiar with, and you need more information, they're out there. The Scientific American, that's my source there for this one. The Union of Concerned Scientists, they explain in detail all the different things that we can do. And the amazing thing about a lot of these things, they're what they're called no regrets solutions. If you make these changes, they won't cost you as much as you think they will. They won't impact the economy in the way you think they will, and they will provide such a positive boost in so many ways, you'll have no regrets for making these changes, even if climate change wasn't occurring. So there's a lot of no regrets type solutions out there. Now, some are more controversial. Nuclear energy in particular is one that there's a lot of disagreement of whether or not this is a route we should take. And the reason why nuclear energy is such a concern is we still haven't figured out where to put all of the spent fuel. And the spent fuel stays radioactive for thousands of years. So we don't have a storage place here in the United States in particular, and other nations don't have good storage places. And so what do you do with that spent fuel that could be used as a dirty bomb material? So a lot of security issues with nuclear. But again, a lot of these are simple things. The search for low carbon or zero carbon technologies and sustainable development, making sure that we use our resources at a rate that doesn't deplete them faster than they can renew themselves. So a very important issue to address, but we already understand how these things work. We already understand a lot about nature and how nature can help us with these problems, and we just have to learn how to make leaves and use the chlorophyll to make energy and duplicate a lot of these things, and we'll work our way out of the problems. But the core of the two methods to address climate change revolve around these two principles, adaptation and mitigation. And we're going to have to adapt to a changing climate. And here in our county in particular, we're going to have to do more shoreline restoration. We may eventually have to address the fact that we have a whole lot of hotels sitting right on the beach, and sea level is going to rise, and something's going to happen bad to those hotels. It may not happen in my generation, but it may happen in your generation. So something to think about. So adaptation, those are going to be some interesting conversations because there's going to be a lot of trade-offs. Mitigation, a lot of those things are happening now. There's the trends toward renewables, taking out the old lights and replacing them with compact fluorescents or LEDs. All those transitions are already beginning. You're seeing more cars that get great gas mileage. You're seeing more electric cars. So a lot of those things are already happening. Mitigation is being addressed in a variety of ways. The President's Climate Action Plan talked about a variety of ways. We're leading in some respects and following in others, and the Europeans are ahead of us in some areas, and even the Chinese are ahead of us in some areas as far as introducing renewables to their economy. So some of the solutions are really fascinating to see how they're going to evolve. Wind is taking off in the middle part of the United States. We have an enormous wind resource, and there's enough wind blowing through the central part of the United States to power us. There's also enough sun hitting the planet in 5 minutes to power the entire planet for a year. So solar is a great opportunity. And electric, hybrid, natural gas, all different ways to address the problem and reduce the amount of greenhouse gases. And then adaptation doesn't necessarily mean it has to be austere. It doesn't mean that we have to give up all of the nice things we have in our life, but it means we have to adapt to the conditions that were being presented and be creative, as in those green roofs on top of the building over there. There are a lot of creative ideas out there that won't ruin your lifestyle, won't ruin your quality of life, and will actually improve a lot of the things that you'll see in your neighborhoods and in your life. But this issue of oil and gas dominating the discussion and has been around a while, and even Thomas Edison thought that, hey, this stuff ain't going to last forever, but the sun is going to be there for a long, long time, so maybe we ought to figure that one out. And there's a lot of new technologies out there, and solar is making a lot of advances in batteries and ways the solar panels can absorb more energy and things like that you ought to investigate. So there are groups out there that have ideas. This is just one of them I picked out, not necessarily one that I endorse, but they have an interesting potential solution to how do we address the carbon problem. How do we mitigate more of the carbon out of our atmosphere?
The climate is changing. Extreme weather is disrupting livelihoods and food supplies around the world. This is observed. document. This is the scientific community's consensus. The climate is changing. Carbon emissions are driving that change. Emissions come from burning fossil fuels. So if we want to slow or even reverse the change, we must lower our fossil fuel use. By charging a fee on fossil fuels and returning that revenue to households as a dividend, we can do just that, starting a chain of positive effects. Fossil fuels become less desirable. Cleaner sources of energy become more competitive. The dividend creates millions of jobs. Carbon emissions go down, reduced air pollution saves tens of thousands of lives, and climate change is brought under control. We can make this happen, but enacting a carbon fee and dividend isn't in our hands, it's in theirs. How do we sway them? What can we do? We can use our voices to express political will and demand action. We must help our elected leaders work together. It's on us to tell them what we want as a group. Because when voices call out together, their impact multiplies. Government can respond to the will of the people, provided we tell the government what we want. And what we want is a livable world. This is what Citizens Climate Lobby works for. To empower citizens to connect with and influence their members of Congress. To spread the idea that each one of us can address climate change. Bring your voice to citizensclimatelobby.org.
Again, there are many different organizations out there similar to the Citizens Climate Lobby that are discussing this issue, that are addressing this issue, that are providing opportunities for people to contact their legislatures and say, this is what I'd like to see happen. So I'd encourage you to check them out and see if there's one out there that might be interesting to you. And here's a whole list of a variety of websites. It's just, there's quite a few out there. But notice that three of the leaders of this are NOAA, NASA, and the EPA. You know, these are scientists giving us ideas. Scientists who are proposing solutions that have been tested and work. So something to consider. But if you really want a website that addresses the climate issue and you got some friends who don't believe climate is a problem, go to skepticalscience.com, because it's run by climate scientists, and they have taken all of the arguments that people who don't believe in climate change, and they have addressed them and in a scientific way, and they show either the weaknesses or the flaws in the arguments so that you can have a good discussion with those who maybe consider climate change a hoax or whatever they might consider it. That row. Sources and a closure. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
What changes have you made in your life, and was it difficult to make those changes?
I got terrible hearing, so you'll have to repeat.
Okay, and I speak too low, so that's a good combination. What changes have you made, and was it difficult to make those changes?
I have a hybrid car, easy as pie. A little bit more expensive at the time when I bought it. Gets 40 miles to the gallon, so that helped. I took out the compact fluorescent lights, and I've been putting in LED lights. The house that we bought has blown-in insulation so that it increases the less heat release and also keeps it cool in. We have what they call high energy efficient heating and cooling, heat pump type things. And we also have a metal roof on our house, which is long lasting and also helps reflect back some of the heat. And we also try to buy from companies that are sustainable and also environmentally concerned. I use my dollars to speak for me a lot. So one of my favorite companies is Patagonia. And if you go on their website, you'll learn a lot about Patagonia, and that they're committed to not only making clothes that are less environmentally impactful, but they want to pay a fair wage, and they also want to make sure that one of their new programs is they tell you if you don't need it, don't buy it. You know, and that, you don't hear that from a lot of companies saying, don't shop if you don't have to, but they're doing that. So, but there are other companies out there. Look at their social model and their economic model, and then determine where you're going to put your dollars. And that makes a big difference. Yes, sir?
Did I hear you correctly that wind power is on the no regrets solution for, so there's some studies about what do the wind farms do with the
Right.
pollinators, the path of migratory birds,
Yeah,
that sort of thing. So,
An interesting comparison, the number of birds killed by large skyscrapers is enormously greater than the number that have been killed by the wind farms. Now, the wind farms, they have to site them properly. They have to figure out, are they putting them in a place where the birds are migrating, things like that. And now as they're growing in size, one of the interesting things is the blades revolve slower, which makes them less of a bird killer. Was that what you were addressing about the wind farms, the concerns?
what's the current status of, is wind power a no-regret solution, or is it?
I would think so.
Next-generation wind power appears
Yeah.
to be going that way.
Without a doubt. The first offshore wind farm is being developed here in the United States. Our first one's coming in, and that's growing now. The middle part of the United States the potential is enormous. So they have a lot of capacity that we could take advantage of. Now, again, there's intermittencies problem. When the wind doesn't blow, we got an issue, right? However, if you have what they call a smart grid will take the wind power from a section of Kansas where the wind is strong and send it to a part of Texas where the wind ain't blowing. So if we develop a smart grid that can understand the system and then provide the electricity to the areas where it needs it, and it can also work with solar, then you fill a lot of those gaps. Was there a question over here?
I was just going to piggyback onto that because I asked the same question at a talk last year because I've worked with people that work with bats and birds, and they look at some of these things and they're like, there's just dead birds all over the place. I think with the last model, they figured out that they were giant bird guillotines, and so they slowed them way down. So the new generation, the previous one, the tips of the blades are going 300 miles per hour, and now they're going way, way slower. So they're
Much more efficient. Those larger turbines produce huge amount in comparison to the ones you'd see in California and the Altamont Pass and things like that.
Will we pay for a smart grid?
Sir?
Where does the money come from to pay for a smart grid?
Oil companies. If you tax, and that was part of the climate change citizens lobby. They say, all right, you tax gasoline, and then you give part of that money back to people based on their need, and then you take the rest of that to put into smart grids. And also, all of you've never heard of a Gulf Power going out of business. You never heard of Duke Energy going out of business because they're always guaranteed a profit. We did that. We write it into our legislation that Gulf Power always makes a profit. Well, how much should they make? We can discuss that. Should they make 10%, 15%, 5%, or should they just make enough to continue to operate? That's something we can discuss. But as we phase them out and we bring in new industries and things like that, there's a lot of ways to subsidize these things by removing the other costs. If there's less air pollution because we're not using fossil fuels, there'll be less demand on our healthcare system because less people will have respiratory problems, so our healthcare cost should go down.
Yes. But you know what's going to practically happen.
What's that?
It'll be a cost savings for someone. They don't want to spend it on something else.
And so, managing that's a challenge, isn't it? And the politics of getting that transition is difficult. But we did transition from whale oil and wood to oil and natural gas. Some people went out of business, some people didn't. Some people got rich, some people didn't. So, it depends upon how we want to do it. If you let capitalism do its thing, there'll be lots of winners and there'll be lots of losers and it'll be ugly. If you manage it, you may be able to mitigate some of that. But some people don't want to manage capitalism, so we'll have to discuss that.
Yeah, they don't want to create winners and losers.
Exactly, and who gets to decide those? Yes, sir?
There's another paper that's come out recently, and it was actually by capitalist,
Mhm.
but it's kind of risky. It's entitled. Have you read heard of Risky Business?
Yeah.
And basically, that is a plan. And one of the people that was the co-author actually runs an eco resort in
Mhm.
Georgia. And the whole idea is that it's risky business to ignore climate change.
Yeah.
That's going to cost us more in the long run that we have to be proactive with.
Yeah.
That's the whole.
One of the biggest advocates, one of the biggest pushers for climate change is Swiss Re. Swiss Re is the largest insurance company in the world. Why would an insurance company say, do something about climate change? Because they insure us. If you lose your property due to a flood, Swiss Re, if they're insured, has to pay. So this insurance company says, we got to do something about it, because you saw the one map that showed the billion-dollar losses. Some insurance company's going to have to pay for some of those losses. So the insurance companies are saying, we need to fix this climate change problem, otherwise we're going to lose everything we have. So they are huge advocates for fixing climate change and addressing it now. And they have a lot of money too. There's a lot of resources there that could help move that in the right direction. But again, these companies can't move until uncertainty is removed in some areas. Until they know that governments are going to tax carbon, and they're going to reduce fossil fuels, and they're going to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases, they're going to wait. They're going to sit on the sidelines because they don't want a huge loss. Yes, ma'am.
Can you explain how carbon credits are traded globally?
When we first started out, there was a simple idea that if you reduce your amount of greenhouse gases you put into the atmosphere, you get a credit. And then you could take your credit and you could sell it to somebody else who is still producing those greenhouse gases. And that got all convoluted. It's like, okay, that means that when you sell it to is not going to reduce their credits. You reduce yours. We have a reduction, but we still have this person who's buying your credits and you're making money. So the trading really got messed up because people were not actually reducing the amount of carbon that was being put in the atmosphere. So, and what we tried to do was pay people to reduce carbon emissions, and it really didn't work. Or we tried to create a market, and we've had a real hard problem with that because the price skyrocketed at first. You make a lot of money when you reduced it, and then all these polluters would buy up the credits and continue to pollute. So whether or not that market will reemerge, I don't know. It's still active in Europe. They're still selling credits and things like that. Much of the money is going to Eastern European polluters to keep their mills open and plants open, while the Western European plants continue to reduce their emissions by using new technology. What should be flowing is the new technology to help them, but they're just using the credits to hold off until they can make a change. So it's a flawed attempt to use the market. It had potential, but smart people in the market took advantage of it, and there wasn't enough guidance. Yes, ma'am.
It's my understanding that airplanes are one of the major issues.
Yeah.
I mean, like, that you don't hear about much.
Mm-hmm.
Are you aware of anything
Oh, yeah.
being addressed? Anything
A variety of ways. The new, it's a 787 or something like that, the Ecoliner, the Dreamliner from Boeing, supposed to have a huge reduction in fuel use, which again reduces emissions. So the companies are aware of that, and they're building aircraft that are much more fuel efficient, and they're able to go much further on a tank of gas. You probably heard about the solar plane that flew around the world. Yeah, a small aircraft, well, not so small, but it flew entirely around the world based on just solar power. There's another company that's developing giant dirigibles for mass movement of people and things.
Yes.
One of them crashed recently, it just kind of nosed in. But the dirigibles have a lot of potential because they're not using flammable hydrogen anymore, they're using helium. So they're able to, great lift capacity, not very fast, but if you're talking about going point A, point B in a city, they have a lot of potential. So the airlines are under a lot of pressure to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas they produce. And I believe President Obama has legislation coming out soon that will force them to make more changes. In Europe, they're already ahead of us, so it's forcing our hand. unfortunately, in some areas. Yes, sir.
Isn't there a big there's a big problem with rocket launches too? Apparently, whenever they send a satellite up, the stuff that comes out of those rockets is some of the nastiest stuff
Yeah.
you can put in the atmosphere. So is there any progress on that front?
Well, I haven't heard anything, but you're absolutely right. Some of especially the liquid fuels that they use in the rockets, the atrazine and the hydrogen fuels are very toxic. I have not heard of any opportunities. Now, there are some ideas about different ways to launch. You take a balloon, you take your payload up as high as you can get in the atmosphere, and then you launch it using a lot less fuel and things like that. There's talks about nano ladders, a nano structure that would get you up in this high in the atmosphere, and you launch from that. Don't know where that one's going to go. So there's a lot of futuristic ideas to improve our launch capability, because the atmosphere does create a lot of drag, and then you expend an enormous amount of energy just to get into the atmosphere. So what will probably happen is we'll have a space station that eventually where all the launches to further parts of the space occur, and we'll just figure ways to float things up to that space station and get it up there using balloons. But we'll see about that. But yeah, that's an interesting issue. And right now, near-Earth orbit is hugely crowded with a lot of stuff. So one day your satellite and your cell phone is going to go down, and the reason it went down is because your satellite collided with something in space. And there's a lot of stuff in space right now. There's a lot of concern about that. What's that?
You're saying that's not a good place to send the spent nuclear fuel then?
No, that one, that was a proposal and you know, there were a couple of launches by us and the USSR at the time of spacecraft that were nuclear powered. So you put a nuclear reactor up in space and hope nothing happens during the launch and hope nothing happens to it while it's up there, realizing that one day it comes down. And one of the Russian ones did recently come down, and they were very concerned, where is the core going to land, what will happen, and things like that. Now, you probably wouldn't have a nuclear explosion, but you'd have radioactive material all over the place. So, you know, that kind of shot down that idea, the idea of nuclear-powered spacecraft and things like that that are launched up. You could build it up there and use it to go from place to place, but you don't want to launch it because something might happen. And it may not stay up there forever. Yes, sir?
Could you address biofuels, specifically wood pellets as a source of fuel by Europe?
Yeah. What do you think? Do you think they are a net positive for the environment, or do you think they're a net negative for the environment? Negative, why?
Well, because they probably produce more CO2 than an equivalent amount of fossil fuel.
Okay, so would you recommend a fossil fuel as opposed to?
No, but in the South, specifically, our own port is shipping wood pellets over to Europe, and it's being subsidized so that it's profitable for them to use our own southern hardwoods to burn for fuel.
And the idea behind that is that because it's a tree that was grown, absorbed carbon, that carbon dioxide was already here. It was not new carbon dioxide like coal. When it's burned, that's old carbon dioxide that wasn't in the atmosphere for thousands of years. So it's a net zero when it comes to more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for a tree. That's why the Europeans want it, because they're saying we're reducing our CO2 emissions because we're burning something that doesn't create more carbon dioxide. You burn oil or gas, you put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
Whether it's just rocks, it releases the same amount of carbon dioxide.
And that carbon dioxide has been in the atmosphere, so that plant sucked it out of the atmosphere, captured it for a while, and now you're just putting it back. It has not increased the amount of carbon dioxide in the air. The coal has been buried for a long, long, long time and wasn't in the atmosphere except for millions of years ago. Now you burn it, it adds more carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. So the question is this a net positive or a net negative? Are you helping the environment by burning wood pellets as opposed to oil or gas? From a pure climate change perspective, it's probably a net positive. But then you're cutting down my southern forest so I can help your European friends be more ecologically conscious. So from my perspective, I'm thinking maybe that's not such a good idea that they're cutting down my forest, shipping it overseas, and using it to power their homes. when perhaps maybe solar might work better, or wind or something like that, and I can leave my forest intact as a carbon sink to hold that carbon dioxide in, and maybe even grow more forest to absorb more carbon dioxide. So from my perspective, I think shipping our wood pellets overseas is bad for us, great for the Europeans, but bad for us. Any more questions? Again, you can see the complexity of this issue because whether or not something is polluting or helping or not, it depends. It depends upon a lot of the processes, and it depends upon a lot of the political gyrations that go on. Even biofuels are considered negative by some people, positive by others. Yes, ma'am?
Yeah, isn't the issue of corn, how much water
Yep.
it takes to grow the corn?
Right. Versus your net, and pecans in the Central Valley and things like that, hugely water-intensive product, but very profitable. So you're taking all that water, ma'am.
I was just thinking on the biofuel.
Oh yeah, and that's a good argument. Initially, they thought, well, we'll use our excess corn and we'll turn it into ethanol. And what they found was that all of the processes that go into creating the ethanol, you end up with a net negative when it comes to carbon emissions. In other words, it's producing more carbon emissions than it's saving by burning a ethanol fuel. Ethanol produces less carbon emissions than oil or gas or gasoline, but the whole process that went into it. And then you were taking corn off the market that we could sell as food and turning it into a fuel. Profitable for them, but bad for other nations who were dependent upon our corn.
Things like water resource.
Oh yeah, and it's like you said, it's very water intensive. And in the Midwestern part of the United States, there's the Ogala aquifer. Huge aquifer under all of Kansas, Nebraska, everything. It's dropped numerous feet now because we're overusing it. It's not being able to replenish itself quick enough. So there are areas now where they have to drill down hundreds and hundreds of feet to reach this aquifer because they can't grow it just using rain. They have to pump that water out of this aquifer, and they're using water that eventually that's not going to be able to replace, all for corn. And again, is that the best food we could grow? Is that the best use of our resources? Maybe there's other things we can grow. So, but the corn states will tell you, oh no, that's what we want. Ethanol's wonderful because they make money off of it. And so the senators and representatives from the corn states are saying, more ethanol in your tank. So, but it's not really a net positive, as we found out. Environmentalists loved it at first, but then more research.
Then they were doing research on algae.
Yeah, the algae is really interesting, but again, there's always trade-offs because algae takes water. So, all right, let's use water. Why don't we use gray water? If you're familiar with the concept of gray water, that's something out of your sink when you wash your dishes and stuff like that. So we'll use the gray water. We'll put the algae in it. The algae will grow, and it'll clean our water. And we'll take the algae out, and we'll use it to make fuel. Because certain species of algae are hydrocarbon intensive, and we can make all kinds of fuels from this algae. So they're researching that right now, but again, it depends upon where you do it, and it depends upon your amount of water you got. So those are issues that are also going to be heavily influenced by climate change. So, but algae is an interesting one because it grows fast. You can modify it. You can mutate it into a species that produces even more of the things you want. It can be easily converted into a fuel source.
That is awesome.